All right, well, welcome everybody. And this will be the first episode of VALR Unfiltered, Money, Meaning and Society. And so I'm very excited about this. Welcome, Hermann Vivier.
Awesome.
Very good to have you here.
Cool, man. Thanks.
You know, this webinar, well, now it's more like a one-on-one. But I'll see over the next few weeks like what this is going to be like. Like sometimes it'll be a one-on-one, sometimes it's more of a group discussion. The whole idea is really, rather than an interview, this is more of a kind of open discussion where we can explore some deeper concepts. And specifically in this episode, I want to really explore the concept of prosperity and what that means to us, what it means to you. Whether it's from the perspective of Bitcoin or your project Bitcoin Ekasi or just in general. And I think maybe to explain a bit more, as you know, I come from VALR, a crypto exchange in South Africa. And, much more than just a trading venue and getting people into this asset class, I also think it's about creating a new culture where we think about money, we think about value, we think about society and a form of conscious finance, you could say. So I welcome you very much. Maybe you can take some time to introduce yourself and also, of course, talk a little bit about Bitcoin Ekasi so people have the context.
Yeah, sure, man. My name is Hermann, as you mentioned. I am sitting in Mossel Bay, just outside Mossel Bay in South Africa. It's a tiny little town, relatively speaking, sort of off the edge of the map. Near the southern tip of Africa. I run a Bitcoin adoption project called Bitcoin Ekasi. And we're trying to build a Bitcoin circular economy where we're trying to get people to use Bitcoin as an everyday form of money. That's it in a nutshell.
That's really wonderful. What does it mean, Bitcoin Ekasi, in this context?
What do the actual words mean? Ekasi?
Yes.
Or what is the... Okay. The word Ekasi comes from Afrikaans. Afrikaans is obviously a local South African dialect spoken mostly by white people, but also by the colored community. And the word it's derived from is Lukasi, which means location. And it comes from the apartheid days when non-white people were forced to live outside of the big cities and towns, and so if you lived there, you lived in the location, and so location Lukasi became Ekasi, but it's a word that's used mostly by people who live in these communities. Outsiders, even local South Africans who don't stay in the township, doesn't know what the word means. It's not only overseas people who ask me what it means. I often get that same question from white South Africans. So yeah.
Yeah, actually it's very relevant to the conversation that I have in mind. When we think about prosperity, it's a concept that I think about a lot. So, right now, at this moment, I'm in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, I'm, really struck by, especially when I'm in the neighborhoods, I'm struck by the kind of various lifestyles that come together. So some houses are quite beautiful, and some houses are very worn down and quite basic, almost like maybe what you'd find in a township. It's kind of makeshift, and it all just kind of blends together. But in my view, that is actually I see it as a sign of prosperity in the sense that everything blends and people are together and share the same streets and share the same reality, even though maybe privately, somebody might own more than another person. Whereas I get, when you speak about this Lokasi idea, I very much get the idea of segregation. Not that it's necessarily a reality now. It might be. I don't know South Africa as well as you do. I've only been there like 3 times. But I think it links into the idea of prosperity. And so, what I've done is kind of come up with three core questions, kind of thematic questions, and surely we can also speak about, have some conversation around your project as it links into these questions. And hopefully at the end of this episode, we'll have a kind of clearer notion of what we believe prosperity really means. Maybe before we start, maybe you have some thoughts already on, when you hear the word prosperity, like what that means to you.
Well, I mean, prosperity to me is it's obviously an incredibly important what could I say? Not a goal as such, because it's not something that you'll ever really achieve. I don't think many people get to a point where they say, okay, now I'm prosperous enough. People tend to keep on building. So prosperity is more of a pursuit, I guess, rather than a goal. But it's a very important pursuit, and it means a lot to what we do. A very large part of why we want to see Bitcoin adoption is so that people can create prosperity for themselves. That's I mean, I often talk to our team and come back to this basic point that if you don't have money, you can't do anything. Like you're stuck at square zero if you haven't got money, and that's that speaks directly to the question of prosperity. So ultimately you can try and solve all the world's problems, but my personal view on this is that you're probably going to fail to solve any of those problems if you don't first address the problem of a lack of prosperity in the lives of people. If let's say you're I mean, obviously I'm quite familiar with the non-profit charity world, because that's the world I operate in, and I often speak to other charity projects. We had quite a long meeting with another charity project yesterday here locally, and let's say you're a charity project and you're looking at broken families, where the relationship between the mother and the father has broken down, and as a result the children are suffering. And your aim as a charity organization is to try and do something about broken families. And there are actual charities like that. I just use it as an example, but there are real organizations doing that. I don't think you're actually going to move the needle much on addressing that problem if you don't first address the problem of prosperity, because it's very likely that the process of the family breaking down has a lot to do with the lack of prosperity, and so that's one of the reasons why we push Bitcoin adoption, because we see it as a fundamental sort of aspect of people's lives. Like if you have that hope that you can build a prosperous future, then many other things start going much better. Your relationship with your family becomes better. You take better care of your children. Your children will likely get a better education, etc., etc., etc. So it's a central question in what we do.
I think it's interesting because just because I'm in Vietnam right now, so this is kind of my context today. But poverty, poverty of course can be very destructive, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But in a country like Vietnam, where there is definitely quite some poverty, I also see a very collaborative spirit, and I see people having to help each other out and work together, and it kind of drives a sense of collective endeavor, which I think in itself, I would say, is also a form of prosperity. Whereas perhaps wealth and wealth accumulation might lead to isolation, you could argue, right? Where a person becomes rich, maybe they move themselves out of a poor neighborhood or a township, or into a wealthy neighborhood. They put the gates around their house, and I'm wealthy, and this is me, and I'm by myself. And I don't know what you think about that. And do you think there's also an inherent risk there in kind of the pursuit of prosperity, and or at least how do you see that in your environment?
It's an interesting question. I think in the local context of South Africa, I think it depends a lot on the culture. Because in the township where we operate, for example, it's not uncommon to see people who have built up significant wealth for themselves, and you see this a lot in the older parts of the township. There were people maybe 3 or 4 generations ago who were definitely living in poverty, but over the generations they have managed to build up some measure of wealth, and it's not uncommon to see large double-story homes, newly renovated, from the from the outside they look beautiful, and they're surrounded by houses that are not nearly as nice. And so in that particular culture, from as far as I could tell, people tend to stay within the community where they and their forefather or their parents and grandparents and so on grew up. So, but then that's that particular culture in sort of if I have to look at my own culture, which is obviously very different. Most of the 99% of the people we work with in the township are Xhosa, which is a Black African culture. My own culture, being white Afrikaans, is very different. I think in my culture that does tend to happen, where people, when they accumulate wealth, they maybe tend to separate themselves, build very high walls, put electric fencing on the walls, and live behind a very, very big gate. So yeah, I suppose it depends on how you were raised and where you grew up and what culture you're from. But yeah, of course, that tendency for people to want to isolate when they become wealthy, I suppose, is there. Yeah, I mean the kind of prosperity I was talking about when I made the first comment was maybe more sort of, if you look at that, the first few steps, rather than the later part of the journey, if I can put it that way. Because there is a point where it becomes too much, obviously.
Yes, no, I fully understand. It's very interesting. So it's definitely maybe culturally specific, and I think about this topic a lot. Especially when you're confronted with poverty, and like we have to think about what a let's say if Bitcoin gets more and more adoption, like what is the culture that we're actually aiming for? And I really hope that it will be coupled with a culture of generosity, and I really mean heartfelt generosity. Because, I don't know how far it will go, right? What a Bitcoin standard really looks like in the future. But let's say if we're not dependent on a tax system where you're kind of forced to pay a certain amount of your income and your holdings, but rather, I'm thinking like maybe 100 years, further into the future. But hopefully, a culture of generosity exists where your own prosperity is very deeply tied to the prosperity of others around you. And whether that's at a local level in a township or on a global scale, there are countries that might suffer while other countries, right across the border are incredibly wealthy. And it's not even about tariffs and stuff. Like, I know that's going on today, but this is an age-old problem, of course, where we kind of build certain borders around us and say, okay, this area, this is where we're going to focus our endeavor to be prosperous, and over there, well, that's not our problem. So it's just something I'm thinking about in terms of what does a global culture of prosperity look like, or what do we want to build? And then I'm curious in your project. Yeah, I'm curious in your project if you have these types of conversations as well with the people you engage with. Like, do they think about? I mean, they must think about accumulating wealth. I mean, in the monetary sense. But then do they also think about what do they want to do with that? Is there any financial planning? Is there any thinking about what's actually the goal of accumulating money?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, we're in the very early stages now, I think. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm very, very curious to see how this plays out. I mean, anything that anybody says is a little more than an educated guess, because we're talking about the future here. We don't know how it's going to go, but yes, there's this question of what does the world look like when Bitcoin becomes the world's dominant form of money, rather than fiat, where it's all focused around centralized control. And hopefully at that point there's a significant enough number of people who still self-custody their Bitcoin, because obviously that the question of voluntary tax kind of implies that you're self-custodying your assets. If your assets are with a bank or whatever the case may be, then Bitcoin kind of loses that magic property. And then it becomes a question of, as you say, voluntary assistance to those who need it most. It's almost like, I mean, I know this is a dirty word in the Bitcoin circles, but it's a kind of a bit of a communist idea, isn't it? Like we are helping each other. Well, not really. It's less communist than the state being the one responsible for it. I think it makes far more. I think private charity is almost like an inherent human part of human nature. People have a natural inclination to want to help their fellow humans, especially the ones that are very close to them, their immediate family, their friends, then their community. Not so much at a national level. So I think a part of this conversation is definitely a more decentralized governance system. Like just speaking from my own perspective, I would be far more willing to contribute some of my Bitcoin, which it's held in self-custody, towards a sort of a tax pool, if I know that the people running that is a local government and that the local government has full control over that money and decides how it gets spent, and I can see the effects within my immediate surroundings, rather than contributing that to a national pool where I don't know the people who run that fund. I see their faces from time to time, but I can't get a meeting with the president. I can't sit down with the finance minister, but I can do that at a local level. I've met the local mayor from Mossel Bay several times, and we are friendly with each other. And if I really have to, I suppose I could get to him and ask him questions and say, hey, what the hell's going on here? Like, what are you doing with this money or that money? So I think we could see a very prosperous world where the giving happens voluntarily, if you at the same time see a devolution of power towards the local level and a decentralization of power, because people will be more naturally inclined to help contribute towards their local environment, rather than like a national, or even worse, an international authority. I mean, these global authorities are the worst of its kind, but even on a national level, I think it's too much. It's too much power in the hands of a few people. So yeah, I think we could see a very prosperous world. I mean, and to get back to the question of prosperity on the people in our project that I work with, it's fascinating to see them think about this and go over this question. And I think most of their attention, when they do start to become more prosperous, because we have employees and people who are indirectly and directly connected to the project, who come from a very, very impoverished background, who have been saving in Bitcoin now for more than 3 years, and so obviously stacking throughout the bear market has had a significant impact on their lives already, and we don't even know where this is going to go. It might go way further than we can imagine. And I think the first thing that they think of, and I guess this is to be expected, it's quite natural, they start thinking of their children, and they want to see their children live a better life than what they had, if they have, the ones who do have kids, obviously, which is, I'd say about half the people I'm talking about. Education and a better future for their children is top of mind. I think that's when I don't know if that's what you're asking, but I think if you take that first step into prosperity, that's what I see, is that people think of their kids.
I think it's beautiful. It might also be their parents if they don't have children. I can imagine that there's a lot of concern for parents as well, and so, even if one individual in a family can kind of attain a stable position and get that prosperity and be able to spread that around, even if it's just in the family. If you have multiple families, it becomes a neighborhood, right? And if a neighborhood is doing well and there's ties to other neighborhoods, that might also kind of start to overflow, because I assume that these locasis that you're working on, hopefully they will multiply. Right, and if you think, I was thinking about El Zonte, of course, logically, like in El Salvador, which there must be some similarities there. I think that was also born from an individual's generosity, who kind of got that started And similarly, in your case, something is driving you, right, to not just sit at home and trade Bitcoin, but actually go out and spread the news, right, and spread the culture and spread the idea. So what is driving you, actually? I'm very curious about
that. It's an interesting question. I think first, it's worth mentioning on this question of generosity. The original donor behind Bitcoin Beach is still anonymous and is still supporting the Bitcoin Beach project and is still supporting multiple other projects. We recently distributed funds to 23 different projects across Africa who are all trying to do very similar things to what we are doing. Not all of them are sort of non-profit charities like we are, but many of them are. The one thing they all have in common is they're trying to build circular economies, and these funds, it was a significant amount of funds that we distributed among these projects, and all of this is coming from that. As far as I know, it's coming from this original donor that is still supporting Bitcoin Beach, and nobody knows who this person is, and he or she or they or whatever have been supporting the Bitcoin Beach project since the beginning. I think it first came about in 2018, early 2019, and so it's we're coming up on half a decade, more than that, where this person has just, whoever they are, has just kept supporting. And obviously that's enormous generosity. And the interesting question about all of this is that, and this is what I find so fascinating about this process of adoption and the world moving towards a sound money standard. If we see hyper Bitcoinization, where Bitcoin really does become the dominant global sort of reserve asset, then there's going to be a lot of people with a lot of wealth who do not come from traditionally wealthy backgrounds. Computer nerds who were mining Bitcoin on their laptops in 2010. People like myself who stumbled across it completely serendipitously. Like we, and I talk about myself, but other people like me too. We're a very different kind of person from the people who hold most of the wealth in today's world, where you've got cutthroat CEOs, sort of very ruthless people sometimes sitting at the top of these large international corporations. It's a very different type of person, and these people are going to be the ones who hold most of the wealth. It's hard to say, obviously, because you can't track. It's not easy, to track this. But estimates are, I think, up to 14 or 15 million Bitcoin is held by private individuals. So the largest, and I think this is one of the reasons why Satoshi had this aggressive distribution schedule, where most of the Bitcoin was released within the first 4 to 8 years. By the second halving, 75% of the supply had already been mined, and this means that it's the nerds who picked up most of the supply early on. Obviously, some of them sold as the cycles went on, but still, the vast majority of Bitcoin are held by individuals like myself. Not that I have a lot, but I'm talking about this type of person, the person who comes from a completely different sort of background. And it's going to be fascinating to see what these people do when they become the new sort of, I don't want to call it, but there's no good word for it, but like, what does the world look like when people like me, or people like the donor behind Bitcoin Beach, or the other Bitcoiners that I know, what does the world look like when those are the people who are making the biggest decisions? It's going to be a very, very different world. And I have a suspicion that we'll see a lot more generosity, because at the end of the day, the ethos of Bitcoin is one of generosity. Satoshi did not take anything for his creation. He did it and gave it to the world. And that ethos, I think, inspires the majority of people that I interact with in this space on a daily basis. So it's going to be an interesting. I think we're going to see a lot of generosity and a lot more prosperity as a result.
Yeah, I really agree, and I think it's a reason for hope. I think that whether it's in the townships or just ordinary people who used to, or you know, whatever, the coders who used to mine Bitcoin, and you know, now they have a lot of Bitcoin. There's a lot of questions that will come to you, and you start to question money, you question power structures in society. You know, maybe a few years ago, if you hold 100 Bitcoin, it's not so much, but now it's quite substantial. So, you know, hopefully it impels people to want to pull other people in, because you get some criticisms. You know, some people say like, you know, Bitcoin is for the rich. Bitcoin is very centralized in terms of its holding, kind of the distribution. But that discounts what people are capable of doing, right? Which is not just hoarding wealth, but actually spreading wealth. And I see it in projects like yours. I see it around the world. Actually, there's plenty of examples of people that are coming to positions of wealth and power, and do so with a completely different approach. Also because of the background that they've come from, you know, a different background. So I believe it's really a reason for hope. And I think maybe a question that we could explore in this context is not so much like, let's talk about poverty, let's talk about financial exclusion. I think we know what that looks like. It's pretty terrible, pretty hopeless, and pretty damaging. But then let's think, what does financial inclusion look like in your mind? You know, once it's in a good way, like what does financial inclusion look like when we say, wow, people are now financially included? What does that mean to you?
It's a fascinating question. But before I say something about that, I just want to touch on this point you mentioned with Bitcoin ownership being centralized. And I think it's a fair point to say that it is relatively centralized, because like I said, by the second halving, you know, in 2016, 75% of the supply had already been mined. You know, today we're well over 90% of the supply having been mined. You know, so when we see news of, you know, the Michael Saylors of the world and US Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and so on and so forth, these large entities, BlackRock, these large entities who traditionally are the ones who have been controlling the world and pulling the strings and making the big decisions. And this is not conspiratorial. This is just to say that wealth buys power, and that's, you know, just obvious. So these guys are kind of late to the party, and that's what I like about the centralization of Bitcoin ownership. I wouldn't say it's centralized. I would say it's concentrated amongst a particular type of person. And I can't necessarily, you know, say who introduced me to Bitcoin, but the guy that introduced me to Bitcoin, that this was in the middle of 2013, and that was quite early. I mean, I bought a little bit of Bitcoin. I mean, I was basically, you know, as close to a beach bum at that point, just giving surf lessons and living month to month on the little bit of cash that I made, you know, giving surf lessons. But I did buy a little bit of Bitcoin near the top in 2013. The guy that introduced me to Bitcoin was even earlier than that. I mean, he lost some of his coins on Mount Gox. That's how early he was to Bitcoin. And if I think about that kind of person, and I know him very well, we're good friends. We're still in touch to this day. We speak from time to time, and it's fascinating having known this person for so long. That's the kind of guy. When we say Bitcoin ownership is concentrated, that's the kind of person we're talking about. And he's the most amazing human being, because he's always questioned the world. He's always questioned authority. He's never taken things at face value, but he's asked the question, but is this really the way it is? And that's the kind of person that got early into Bitcoin. And I wouldn't mind a world where those are the kinds of people who are open and questioning and suspicious of authority and control. I don't mind a world where most of the wealth is concentrated amongst people like that. And these people don't necessarily all know each other. They're not a little evil group sitting together and making plans. Most of them probably don't know one another. they just, like me, happened to stumble across it through a bit of luck and maybe a bit of divine intervention. I don't know what you want to call it, but I think it's a fascinating world where those are the people making much bigger decisions, because it's a completely different kind of person. And I have no problem with seeing Bitcoin concentrated in those hands, because as far as I can tell, those people are the most incredible human beings I've met, and I've met quite a lot of them, obviously. Early adopters, people who came into this thing with almost like a religious conviction that this thing can make the world a better place. Why would you not want to see those people, attain a higher standing in the world? So yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what happens. I'm trying to remember what was the thing you actually asked. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent.
No, it's good. I actually it's really good. Maybe I'll respond a little bit to what you said, because what came to mind is that two things come to mind. One is that when the price rallies happen, we know that a lot of speculators come and join the party. And when the dips happen, it's usually the speculators, short-term holders, who end up selling, and that accumulate. In a sense, it kind of like these extreme kind of rallies and dips. They help in terms of distribution. New people coming in, and when the price dips, new people coming in. But also, it's kind of a way for, the diamond hands, the idea of diamond hands, like it goes from speculators to the holders, right? And so then the question is, okay, who are the holders? That's the second point. Are they just holding so they can become wealthy and spend it on a car? But then you realize, but that doesn't seem to be the nature of most, let's say, of most of what Bitcoin culture stands for. Like, if anything, people hold on to their assets, hold on to their Bitcoin, and don't want to exchange that for a car that loses value the moment you buy it, right? Or don't want to spend it on, some party, some extravagant party, because it's like a loss, right? Because you have this in mind that Bitcoin accumulates, appreciates over time. So it's a very interesting dynamic, which I can't think of any other example actually of having seen that before. It's a very special dynamic that's already now happening for 15 years. And you could extrapolate that and say, okay, what about in 20 years, 50 years from now? How would that have been distributed, to people that are firm holders and people who don't want to live extravagant lives, but rather, as they become wealthy, what's really worth it, right? When you say, I'm going to part with some of my Bitcoin, I think helping another person is pretty valuable and pretty significant and worth it. Don't you think?
No, absolutely. It's a fascinating question to think about. What does the long-term holder look like? And even more fascinating is that most of these people will probably never really know. I think most of these people are by their nature. I even myself, I don't always enjoy all the attention that this project brings to me personally, because Bitcoiners by their nature are a little bit reclusive, and it's just, I don't want to say antisocial. That's the wrong word. So most of these long-term holders, we won't know who they are. To this day, I can't even imagine, the donor that's supporting Bitcoin Beach. Like, well, what does this person look like? Who are they? They obviously have a significant amount of Bitcoin. I don't even want to try and guess a number, because it's, but to do what they do, they must have a significant holdings, and yet they're this generous. And it's a fascinating question. Like, who are these people? And yes, it's almost like the question of who is Satoshi himself, because Satoshi is holding what, if he's still alive, is holding what, close to 1 million Bitcoin. I think he's
now
holding
worth 100 billion, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's insane. He could become the world's first trillionaire, if the dollar is still worth anything by that time. So it's a fascinating question, and how generosity ties into that. I think it's a bit of a misconception to say that that it's a complete misconception to say that Bitcoiners are just interested in accumulating wealth and becoming rich and so on. In my experience, it's the complete opposite. Especially with the conference that we've been doing these last 2 years. I've seen people put in endless amounts of their personal time and hours to make a thing happen that gives nothing back to them, other than the fact that they know that they're spreading news and education and understanding of a technology that might make the world a better place. That's the only reason people have been putting in their personal time and effort. So I think, yeah, it's one of the most interesting questions out there to me, is like, what does the psychology of a long-term holder look like, and what's that going to do to the world in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really agree. So the question that I'd put to us is, from a kind of optimistic perspective, and maybe even related to your circular economy idea.
Yeah.
What do we mean by financial inclusion, whether it's at a local level or a global level, right?
Yeah, sorry, that was your question. I should have actually, yeah. With financial inclusion, I mean, it's a word that's thrown around a lot, and I guess my understanding. Let me give you a practical example, and then we can take it from there. So one of the most fascinating things to me, when we first started this project, was, I mean, look, I come from a relatively privileged background. My parents were not rich, but they could afford to send me to university. I spent most of my time at university partying instead of studying. But still, they could afford to send me there, and university in South Africa is quite expensive. So I don't come from a background of poverty at all. I come from a very modest background, but growing up, we had everything we needed. We didn't have more than that, but we had everything we needed, which is very different from the community where our project is based, Bitcoin Ekasi. Obviously, the project is based in a community where there's extreme poverty all over the place. People live in absolute squalor. It's really quite hectic to see. And so it was a new experience for me starting this project because I saw things that I never expected. So one of the things that I wanted to share, and this is the story I want to get to, is what I was very surprised to see, that one of the big things that attracted people to being onboarded to Bitcoin in the very beginning was if you could demonstrate to them that instead of taking cash to buy phone credit, you can have a digital wallet that you can download within minutes. There's no KYC attached to it, so that you don't have to go stand in a queue at a bank or whatever to open the account. It's basically downloading the app on the smartphone, and then within minutes you can buy phone credit. And that might not sound like much, but then if you think about, okay, let's say that person never had digital money before. What did their life look like if they ran out of phone credit 10 o'clock in the evening? Now it's dark, there's no street lights, crime in these neighborhoods is a huge issue. We've had people who work for us who get stabbed for $5. It's ridiculous. And so what does your life look like if you need to make a phone call or send a message to someone or talk to your family? You run out of phone credit, it's 10 o'clock in the evening. Now you have to walk to the nearest shop, physically walk there with cash in your hand to go buy phone credit. And when I looked at it from that perspective, I was like, well, of course this is amazing for them, because now it's like, oh wow, I can sit at home, I don't have to leave my house, and I can buy phone credit from my home using a digital wallet that's on my phone. And it was very easy and it was very accessible, and it was like we used that demonstration of install the wallet, put some sats in the wallet, install an app like Bitrefill, All this happens within 5 minutes. Don't have to go anywhere. Don't have to submit any documents. Even if you're in the country illegally and you don't have the papers to be here, you can still do it. And we used this demonstration again and again and again to onboard people who were skeptical about Bitcoin in the township. And within a matter of 10 minutes, they were like, "Holy shit! Where can I get more of this? I want some more Bitcoin." So that to me demonstrates what financial inclusion looks like. It's a real world story of a change in perception within a matter of minutes, because all of a sudden you can do something that you couldn't do before. You've immediately solved a major problem with a piece of technology.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was thinking about, so actually your example is really amazing, because it seems not to be about finance at all, but rather about kind of quality of life, basic things like safety and practicality. Often when we talk about financial inclusion, it becomes about, there are 2 billion people unbanked. And it's like, well, if it's up to Bitcoin, everybody is unbanked, there's no, right? Being banked is not the definition of being included. Instead, what I'm thinking is, let's say you don't have a bank account, so it's not so easy for you to on-ramp into Bitcoin with fiat. I think in your example, because you have a circular economy, then it becomes about, okay, cool, I want more Bitcoin. That helps me solve certain issues in my life. So how can I get it? Can they work for Bitcoin? Can they engage in a trade? Can they sell some sandwiches and get some Bitcoin for that? Is that basically what's happening in these townships?
I mean, it's going to be difficult to. I've asked myself the question: how do you replicate this project in other places? And we've seen many projects being replicated, but so far when it comes to poor neighborhoods, the model seems to be that you got to find an existing charity and basically orange pill the charity and say, look, let's say it's a soup kitchen, or let's say it's somebody doing whatever. There are so many charitable people around the world running charities, but they're all running on fiat. The way this gets replicated, I think, is if you start, instead of trying to onboard people in these various townships, you onboard the people who are running the charities and say, look, if you really want to make a difference, because I can see that you're trying to make a difference, but if you really want to make a difference, you've got to basically swap your charity from a fiat standard to a Bitcoin standard, and then you're really going to start seeing a difference in your work, because it's very hard to expect people who live in poverty to go out and buy Bitcoin. I don't see how that's the way it gets adopted in situations where there's extreme poverty. But if you have people who are working in those situations where there are so-called handouts taking place, whether it's through food distribution or clothing distribution, that charity has a lot of roots into these communities normally. And if these charities can get orange pilled and you can get them to operate with Bitcoin, that is a way to slowly but surely get sats into the hands of people, and it has to be slowly. You can't go to someone who's unemployed, or maybe even someone who's earning like $10 a day or whatever the case may be, and all of a sudden give them a stack of Bitcoin. Like that's a disastrous idea. It has to happen slowly but surely over a period of time. I mean, prosperity takes responsibility. Like without responsibility, you're going to waste it. So, and responsibility takes time to learn. So, if you're talking about more middle class environments and neighborhoods, I can see how Bitcoin gets adopted by people actually converting some of their savings into Bitcoin and buying and stacking over time. But it's probably not going to happen that way in poorer communities. You could do it through the way we did it, or I suppose there's other ways of doing it too. But yeah, also interesting question.
That's actually a good example what you mentioned when we spoke about what does a long-term holder looks like. What does a long-term holder look like? If somebody earns $2 a day and suddenly they get $10,000 in Bitcoin, it's very likely that very quickly they'll sell that Bitcoin.
Oh, absolutely.
And
yeah.
and spend it, and then actually they're not holding it anymore. And who bought it from them? Whoever, right? Like it's interesting because it makes, like, Bitcoin makes its way to the long-term holders, but also creates new long-term holders. As you mentioned, people do convert their savings, and as they start to convert their savings, maybe their behaviors change, and yeah, it's a gradual kind of process that's happening globally. I would say even institutions rethinking their treasuries, and companies rethinking their strategies, governments rethinking their holdings. I think all of it matters. Even at the government level, like, ever since I can remember, there's been complaints about federal spending, right? And about money printing and about the M2 money supply. Like, cool. And we know now that Bitcoin really calls for prudence. So it might take a while. We might see more money printing. And like, a Bitcoiner is not necessarily unhappy when money gets printed because, you know, usually it flows into, like, Bitcoin kind of correlates with the M2 money supply, right? So, like, we're happy to see Bitcoin go up, but underlying that is, of course, the principle that we don't like money printing, and we don't like the idea that government can create money out of thin air. And the whole idea is that Bitcoin is not money created out of thin air. That's the big misconception as well, I would say, in society. It's really interesting. To me, in itself, the launch of Bitcoin was also the launch of a new culture that still needs to take shape.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mean, look, the idea, this is one of the biggest misconceptions. I think when people come into Bitcoin, they see it as a technology, and of course it uses technology. You know, the whole network. It's a network of computers. So obviously it is a technological thing. But I think one of the keys to understanding of what's really going on here and what's busy happening, and how Bitcoin ties into it is to understand that money is actually a part of human psychology. It's a very, very, very deep part of how we function in the world. You know, this idea that I give something to get something, and I always want to see a fair trade when I do that. Nobody is going to go out into the world and voluntarily, repeatedly put themselves in a position where they're trading a part of themselves, their time, their energy, whatever, for something that they don't feel is worthwhile. You know, they might do that once or twice, but, you know, most people will not do that repeatedly. We have this inherent idea that we wanna have a fair trade. I will do something for you, but then when the time comes, you need to pay me back and do something for me. And if that exchange doesn't happen, then the relationship tends to break down. And that's a very, very, very old concept. It kind of even, you know, predates you know, the use of gold and other rare items as money. That's, you know, I can't remember who it was, but I read a fascinating book on this once where they talk about the so-called credit systems of early civilizations, where everything in the tribe worked really well as long as everybody could remember who owed who what. You know, if there wasn't necessarily money being exchanged, not a physical type of money, but there was a type of credit system where I would do a favor to someone else, and then, you know, 2 weeks later they would return that favor to me. And this goes way back in human psychology. It's very, very deeply rooted in our psyche, and Bitcoin speaks to that, because this is why we don't like money printing, is I'm exchanging my time for something that's being devalued on a daily basis. It feels inherently unfair. You know, it's also kind of like I guess a natural way. I don't think anybody had an evil plan to create fiat. I think it's just kind of it ended up. I mean, Lynn Alden talks about it as being an inevitability. The way that money evolved, you know, from from gold to fiat, it's kind of like a natural evolution. This is what you would expect to see, and if you ran this experiment again, you'd probably get the same results. So I don't see fiat as being evil or money printing as being evil. I think it's just a natural end result of the evolution of money. And now this next stage of the evolution, I think we're in the middle of now, or towards the beginning of, is the transition to a much fairer system, because I think people are beginning to realize that the system we have so far, it just feels unfair, and nobody likes being cheated. It's just human nature, you know.
Yeah. I really think that, this kind of leads to my last question, and then we'll head towards the end of the episode. But like when I look around me, I really love people and I love humanity. But I also think that reality is very warped at the moment. And I think at multiple levels, not just about money. Money, definitely, our vision of money, our view of value, what's valuable in life is pretty warped. You mentioned like you had the opportunity to go study, and I'm not judging, I'm just saying, but you ended up partying, right? And that kind of thinking is a symptom of a society maybe that's kind of confused about our true identity. And there's plenty of that. Stabbing somebody for $5, that's a confused state of living. That's not correct, right? And so maybe you're very poor or they need something. That's fine, but you don't stab somebody. But apparently they thought that was the way to go. And I think this is at all levels of society. And I think there's quite a lot of confusion that needs to be solved, I guess. So for me, the times that we live in, I see this as a time of awakening. I really believe it. I believe that we're awakening kind of en masse. And, the launch of Bitcoin is just part of that. I think there's more to it. When COVID happened, a big pandemic definitely led to some awakening in society. When another war breaks out and we see the horrifying reality of war, hopefully there's more awakening happening. So I look quite optimistically at that. And I think in that regard, and here's my last kind of question. Of course, we're not just dealing with Bitcoin in society, in this industry, sorry. We're dealing with a lot of innovation, a lot of pseudo-innovation, a lot of money, a lot of pseudo-money, a lot of blockchain. And so I think what I want to know is how if we want to be successful. So whether we're just talking about Bitcoin or we're talking about the kind of the success of this industry and driving prosperity. For you, from your perspective, what's necessary? What's necessary for this industry to succeed, if you want to call it an industry at all? What are some of the attitudes or, habits, or what values do we have to kind of commit to in order for this to work out? Or will it just work out?
I don't think it's inevitable. I listened to the podcast was by Peter McCormack, but Danny Knowles now took it over, What Bitcoin Did, and he had I forget his name. He had a person from ocean mining on one of his recent episodes, and it's not the first person to say this. I'm just reminded of this by this recent episode where he said that the biggest danger to Bitcoin is complacency, where we become complacent in believing that it's already succeeded. I don't think it has succeeded. Obviously, I think it's very likely that it's going to succeed, but that depends on whether there's people driving it in the right direction. I think, for example, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, nation-state adoption, Bitcoin strategic reserve, all of this that's happened recently. I think it depends on people remaining healthily suspicious of trusting governments to take this forward. I'm not saying government adoption of Bitcoin is a bad thing or a good thing. I'm saying that we need to remain suspicious and inquisitive and questioning. We can't just say, oh well, we've won because the US government now has a strategic Bitcoin reserve, it means we've won. It's like, and the same goes for BlackRock trying to buy up all the Bitcoin they can, and Michael Saylor trying to buy up all the Bitcoin they can. We have to remain remain vigilant, if I can put it that way. It's not to say that we should treat these people as enemies, but we should just remember that vigilance and skepticism are what got us this far. That's where Bitcoin comes from. I think I'm sort of, I would say I put myself in that camp of I'm a friendly Bitcoin maximalist, if I can put it that way. And what I mean by that is that I don't necessarily have anything against anyone. I don't have anything against anyone else who is dabbling in all the different varieties of blockchain that's come out. I myself was there at one point. In late 2018, up until middle of 2019, I think I owned so many different shitcoins. I lost track of all of them. One of the reasons I decided to go Bitcoin only was because I was sitting in front of my computer one day and I looked at this spreadsheet where I had the list of everything that I was trying to track, and I got to the point where I realized I don't know how 80% of the things on this spreadsheet work. I don't know what they do. The only thing I know is the price and whether it's going up or down. And I asked myself the question, well, if you don't understand how this works and you don't understand what it's doing, what on earth are you doing holding it? And I realized at that point as well that there's so much about Bitcoin itself that I don't understand, that I could spend the rest of my life simply studying Bitcoin and I'd still not completely understand what this is or how it works. But it was a phase that I had to go through, and I'm not saying that it will be a phase for everyone else. Some people will probably remain diversified into other crypto assets for the rest of their life, and that's totally fine. I think part of what's happening here is that this is as you said, it's an awakening, and an awakening is something that happens internally within each and every single human being. It's not something that's enforced from the outside, and I think this is where Bitcoin maximalists are sometimes misunderstood. At least the ones that I hang out with, is that I'm not saying that anybody should come in and enforce the reality that Bitcoin is the only one that should exist. I think the rest of them should exist. And the reason I say the rest of them should exist is because it's a journey of exploration for each individual person to figure out what do they find valuable. Where do they see value? Is it more valuable for them to just track the price and see if they can make some money? That's fine. It's your decision. Or is it valuable for you to try and understand the difference between these different crypto assets that you own? Is it valuable for you to try and understand what all of them are doing? Like, well, what exactly is this one doing? Like, it's a question of discovery. And so I think, if this is going to be a voluntary movement, an awakening, I like the fact that you called it an awakening, because I think I also believe that, and I think it's way more than just Bitcoin. It's an awakening to the horrors of war, as you said. It's an awakening to the level of control within the media that has been exposed over the last few years. It's an awakening to all these things, and if it is an awakening, it has to be voluntary. It cannot be enforced by an authority. It has to be the only authority that matters is the internal conscience within each and every single individual human being. That's the only authority that matters if this is going to be a true awakening. And if that's the case, then you would expect an endless array of alternatives to Bitcoin, well, so-called alternatives to Bitcoin, to exist, because that's just human nature. We're never, we're all going to have to go through this journey of discovery and exploration and figuring out what is and what is not valuable for us. So I think it actually makes total sense if you look at it from that perspective. It makes total sense that there is a whole industry of so-called crypto assets. I think the ones that survive long term are going to be the ones who really solve big problems. And I don't see many big problems being solved today. For example, let's take my favorite shitcoin to dunk on, which is Ripple. I don't see many problems being solved by Ripple today. I know what they say they want to do, which is, one of the things. No, it's not the only thing, but one of the things they say they want to do is be this, the settlement ledger between different banks, so that banks can trade with one another internationally in a much more streamlined way. And I'm like, but why on earth would a bank trust you? Why not? Why would the bank not just build their own one? Like, well, why? So I don't see massive, and that's just one example. I'm not saying that applies to all of them, but the ones that survive, and I don't know which ones will survive. I believe that Bitcoin will survive because I see it solves a very real problem. I mean, recently with the war breaking out in Ukraine, I had the situation where the United States confiscated, I forget the exact number, but it was in the billions of dollars, where they confiscated reserves belonging to Russia. And this is why you saw President Vladimir Putin, who I don't like, by the way. I think he's a absolute, a maniac to some extent. So I'm not expressing support in any way whatsoever here. But what I'm saying is that's why you saw him coming out afterwards saying that nobody can stop Bitcoin and it's a neutral asset. And that's what people want. Everybody wants a neutral asset where they can park their wealth knowing that it cannot be confiscated. Even though they're not doing anything wrong at the moment, the people who custody those assets might believe them to be doing something wrong in the future. So in that way, and that's just one example, in that way Bitcoin already solves a massive problem. And so the crypto assets in this industry that survive long term are going to have to solve real problems if they're going to survive long term. And if somebody comes to me and tells me, look here, this is a problem that this thing solves, and it actually solves that problem, it's not a hypothetical idea. I mean, I'd be the first one to say, well, look, I mean, I was wrong. Bitcoin's not the only one. Clearly, there's something else that's also solving a major problem. But it remains to be seen. I think we're very much still in the discovery phase, of this process, and it's going to be interesting to come back to this conversation in 10, 15 years from now and to see which ones are the ones who actually really survived by solving a real problem in the world. I mean, I think one of the reasons why, it's kind of ironic in a way, but I think Tether is now the third largest cryptocurrency by market cap. I'm not sure if it's number 4 or number 3.
I think it's correct.
But there you have an example of what I'm talking about. It's solving a real problem. There are hundreds of millions of people around the world who want dollars, and they've always wanted dollars, and they could never get their hands on dollars, and now all of a sudden they can. And this is the reason why Tether is doing so well, because it's solving a real problem. I'm not even saying I like Tether. I'm just sort of acknowledging the reality of the situation. That's I think what's going to happen if the industry wants to grow up and mature, then it's going to have to ask itself, okay, what is the actual problem we're solving here? Not what hype are we selling today? What problems do we propose we're going to solve? Give us another 10 years, give us another 5 years. No, what is the actual problem that you're solving today, and show me how you've solved that problem. That I think is what it's going to take.
I think that's another example of awakening, in the sense, like when you just wake up, even when you just wake up, still a little bit confusing, right? A little bit blurry, and maybe this is that blurry moment where, you see some projects and maybe they really have no value at all. But this is the time, unfortunately, when you don't know exactly what's real and what's not real. But time will tell. And I think Tether is a good example. I remember many years ago, I used to write against Tether Actually, I've changed my mind as well. And Tether is king. I think it's doing well, and it deserves to do well. And we had Paulo, the CEO, on a show, not this one, but on the VALR podcast with Farzam, and very decent narrative, and they're very pro Bitcoin. Like, it's not like the enemy of Bitcoin.
Not at all, no.
So, I mean, we have to see how things unfold.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's have.
I just wanted to add there that there definitely is. I mean, technologies build on top of each other. That's what they do. One thing led to another, and another thing led to another, and people still call the devices in their pockets phones, but it's not a phone anymore. It's a computer. It just doesn't look like a computer because it's so small and tiny. And there are existing examples of technologies that have taken parts of Bitcoin and have built on that. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Nostr, which is this decentralized communications network. It doesn't involve a new cryptocurrency asset. You can send Bitcoin back and forth on the network, but it hasn't issued a new crypto asset. But it very much looks like the architecture of Bitcoin in many ways. There's also no blockchain, but it uses aspect of Bitcoin's technology to do something similar but slightly different. It's trying to solve a problem, which is the problem of censorship in communications. And so this is ultimately, there are going to be technologies that come out of this space that do things that Bitcoin can't do. Bitcoin is not made to post pictures of my dog on the beach so that anyone can see it. Nostr is better for that. If I'm afraid that somebody's going to delete my photo, the Bitcoin blockchain is not the place to post it. But the Nostr network is the place to post it. So there are going to be technologies that are inspired by Bitcoin and use some of its architecture that solve for real problems. It's just going to be very interesting to see which ones those are. And I think the example that you give of waking up in the morning, if it's an awakening, you wake up in the morning and you're still a little bit sleepy. I think that's the phase we're in at the moment, where there's I don't know how many thousand, 20, 30,000 crypto coins out there, and it's millions. Like, yeah, we're still millions, yeah. We're still very, very sleepy, because quite clearly we are confused if we think that all of these are going to survive. It's going to be, out of that massive pool, it's going to be very, very few that actually solve a real problem. It's going to be fascinating to see which ones, but I think as far as money goes, that one is being solved by Bitcoin.
I do agree.
It's it's a pretty solid solution so far, and I'm just incredibly grateful that we have that.
Yeah, I really agree, and I know time is running out now, but just as Bitcoin, shouldn't lead to a culture of hoarding, but rather should be coupled with generosity, for example. When you talk about Nostr, for example, which is uncensored free speech, hopefully it should be coupled with kindness. And because, yes, you can say anything and everything you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should. Right? So I think for me, at least, I'm looking at these processes not just as technology will solve everything, but more like there's technology and there's human spirit, and it needs to align, and hopefully then lead to a prosperous future.
Yeah. No, I'm optimistic. I think human nature is inherently positive and good in a way. I mean, we've survived for as long as we have, and that alone says something. We have obviously massive flaws. But our spirit at the end of the day, I think, is something to be optimistic about. It's a story. The human story is one of endurance and survival against all odds. And I think we can and we will use technology to help us in that. But it's gonna get interesting, and at times it's gonna get ugly, and people are going to do things and say things that you don't necessarily want to see happen along the way. It's not a perfect story.
Absolutely. Well, Hermann, I'm going to end it now. It's been 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is really, really wonderful, and I'm very grateful to you. Please don't hang up, though. I'm just going to stop the recording, and that's it for the audience. But thank you very much for joining today. It was a very interesting first episode, so I'm very grateful to you. And
cool, man. Thank you. It was awesome.
Hope to see you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.